This presentation reflects David Bryan's fall into wonder, with Wood's beauty. A retired psychotherapist, rider, craftsman, builder, long-term collector and admirer of exotic woods, he will explore the hidden marvels in wood and compare their extraction to the unfolding drama of the human soul. Wow. Oh, that's something to look forward to. So don't pine. Next week we'll be here soon enough, for sure. Okay, enough of that. Now for the main event. That's what you've come for. This week's presentation, Why Do We Do That? Presented by Sandy Britton. She's always asking me that. Why do you do that? We humans have a lot of strange behaviors. Some that we share with other animals, some we don't. Some that science can explain, and some that it can't. Some that are voluntary, some involuntary. For instance, why do we laugh, gossip, talk to ourselves? Why does every human culture have some form of music? Sandy will explore the quirkier side of human nature, of human behavior. Sandy Britton is from Northern California, where she raised a family with her husband, Dave. Dave? Something you want to tell me? And had a career in information technology. She enjoys exploring aspects of what makes us human and sharing the more interesting discoveries with open circle audiences. Please give a warm welcome to Sandy Britton.
How's that? Ooh. Okay. I'm taking my mask off, so everybody in the front row is now forbidden to cough for any reason. Okay, now I can read my notes. Great. Buenos dias. And thanks for coming. Lovely day. Okay, so as Phil said, what I'm going to talk about is some quirks of human nature. I always try to start with a disclaimer of telling people I'm not a scientist. I like to read about this stuff, and then I get all excited about it and I want to tell somebody about it, and you're my captive audience. Okay, so I developed this talk by following some paths that fascinated me. The topics may seem kind of random. They do have one unifying theme, but my information is only as accurate as my sources, right? Because I'm just reading about this, and that scientific discoveries are constantly changing our knowledge. So if some of this, you find out later that you discover something else, that's probably why. And frequently, even when I'm researching, the sources don't agree with each other. So I'm just gonna tell you the best information that I could find. Okay, so talking about human behaviors, the biggest question with all of these is, why do we have these behaviors? I'm going to be talking about behaviors that are universal to the human species and that are built in. Okay, so there's two fields, one called ethology and another called evolutionary psychology, where they like to look at these universal behaviors and try to figure out what the evolutionary basis of the behavior is. Why do we do that? Well, how does it benefit the species? And so one thing that's obvious to anybody who studies humans is that we're social creatures. We depend on each other to survive, and a good deal of our behavior is social behavior. I think you'll see that as a unifying theme. Okay, now I've got several topics here, not necessarily the ones that were in my blurb, but I don't know if I'm going to have time for them all, so we'll just see how it goes as the time rolls out. Okay, so I'm going to start with the behavior of yawning. Interestingly, yawning is something that we share with every mammal species on Earth. And even some reptiles and birds and fish yawn. Okay, so that's really interesting right at the beginning, is why. Human fetuses yawn as early as the first trimester, which I find really interesting because they aren't breathing yet, but they're going through the motions of yawning. The definition of a yawn is a long inhale, this is on Wikipedia, stretching the jaw, followed by a sigh or short exhale. With a true yawn, the eardrum is stretched, which causes a rumbling sound in the ears. So if you have a true yawn, you're going to hear that sound. And it requires a definite combination of physiological movements. You can't do it with your teeth clenched, for instance. It's not a yawn if your teeth are meeting. Okay, so why do we yawn? Interestingly, there's no definitive answer to this. One of the reasons is that researchers haven't spent a lot of time on it because there's very few like yawn disorders that disrupt human life or anything like that. It's just curiosity that makes them investigated at all. Okay, so first consider, when do we yawn? And the first answer most people would give is we yawn when we're bored or when we're feeling sleepy. But only when you're resisting those feelings, right? If you're sleepy and you just go to sleep, you don't yawn. You yawn when you're trying to stay awake. You yawn when you're bored and you're trying to stay interested, okay? So I'm glad you all have masks. I can't see if any of you are yawning. But anyway, it's also highly related to nervousness. I don't know how many of you have noticed this in yourselves. I noticed myself like yawning crazily when I was going into a job interview one time. Researchers have noticed that people about to jump out of an airplane do a lot of yawning, and certainly they're not bored. Okay? Athletes before a big competition do a lot of yawning. When I was learning dog training, I worked for the SPCA for a few years in Sacramento after my IT career. We felt that dogs yawn when they're nervous. It's one of the signals that tells the owner your dog is nervous or uncertain about something. Some research says that's not true, but I find it very consistent in my own dogs. One of the early theories was that it was related to the intake of oxygen. You know, we were sitting there kind of sleepy, or our carbon dioxide levels get too high, we need some oxygen, and we yawn. But when they've done some actual research on that, they found out that's not true. There seems to be no relationship between blood gases and yawning. Okay, so the research right now, the most accepted theory is that yawning is an adaptation to enhance intracranial circulation and brain cooling. I'm reading a quote from a researcher, which in turn could promote cortical arousal and state change. So in other words, you're actually bringing in air to cool the brain because the brain warms up when you're sleepy or it warms up when you're nervous, and you're trying to get back to a different state. You're trying to get back to a state of alertness or a state of calm. Okay, but another major thing that makes us yawn, other than sleepiness and boredom and nervousness, is when we see other people yawn. Okay, the contagiousness of yawns. And I used to think that was a wives' tale, but as I investigated it, I found out that it's absolutely true, that researchers find that seeing other people yawn makes people yawn. And that even hearing about yawning or reading about yawning makes people yawn. Okay, so I think I see a few out there now. Okay, even blind people, when they hear somebody yawn or read about yawning, tend to yawn. Okay, so it's not just seeing it. And this is true in other species also, that a yawn of one will cause a yawn in the group if it's a social species. And even cross species, there's some evidence that a human yawning can cause your dog to yawn. Okay, so they may actually be interpreting your yawn as a nervousness signal and responding with their own nervousness. So interestingly, babies are not born with this contagion. It starts at about age 5, which is about the age where children really start to be aware of their otherness from other people, their own self-identity, and become self-conscious. And it diminishes with age. So one of the few things they found consistent was that as you get older, the yawn contagion is less effective. Okay, so another interesting thing is people with atypical social responses, such as autistic people or people with schizophrenia, don't seem as affected by the contagion. They're pretty resistant to the contagion of yawns. So that leads people to believe that there's a neurological basis for that contagion. There's something in your brain that is actually reacting to the sight of other people yawning. Another interesting thing is that social expectations affect whether you yawn. And that can affect it in both directions. If you're trying to be polite and you're bored, you may suppress your yawn. But in other cultures, they yawn ostentatiously as a message. So one of the researchers that I was reading about was talking to a group, I believe it was in a small Polish village, and while he was speaking on, I don't remember what subject, everybody started yawning, very ostentatiously, very open mouths, not covering their mouths. And apparently he didn't get the hint and change his topic or liven things up because they actually started getting up and walking out. So they were letting him know, you need to do something or we're leaving. Okay, so as far as the contagion, the best thing researchers have come up with at this point is to think that perhaps it's a way to coordinate a group's level of arousal or alertness. So for instance, if you're in a group and it's, it's getting towards bedtime, you imagine these small bands of people that used to live together, maybe all went to bed at the same time. One would start yawning and the others would see it as a signal of, okay, it's time to start, getting ready for bed. And everybody kind of catches on. Or about to go into battle, and one of them starts yawning as a calming mechanism, and the other one start yawning. So it kind of synchronizes the brain's level of alertness or calm among the group. But there's no definite conclusions about that. It remains a mystery. So even though it's something that every vertebrate does, or every vertebrate mammal anyway does, there's no conclusions onto why it happens. Okay, so that's the topic of yawning. My next one is on laughing. Once again, a universal human thing, but it is not something we share with many other species. There are other species, notably apes, that make sounds, kind of panting sounds when they're playing, that we can kind of call proto-laughter. But if you recorded those and played them back to somebody, they might say, oh, it's somebody having an asthma attack or something like that. It's not something they really recognize, that we would recognize as laughter. And they've even found that rats, when you tickle their bellies, like the pet rats, are emitting a little high-pitched squeak that we can't hear, that sounds a little bit like laughter, a little rhythmic squeak. Okay, in humans, here's the scientific definition. Laughter is a physical reaction in humans consisting usually of rhythmical contractions of the diaphragm and other parts of the respiratory system, engaging the vocal cords and resulting most commonly in the forms of hee-hee or ha-ha. So those are the typical hee-hee, ha-ha that sounds that were made. In response to certain external or internal stimuli. But I want to distinguish between the definition here is for what we would call an involuntary laugh or a belly laugh, a true, genuine laugh, as opposed to a voluntary or social laugh. And we do those all the time. We laugh to be polite when we think somebody's trying to be funny. We laugh to just sound playful or to engage other people because most people find other people laughing to be very engaging. Okay, so people in all cultures laugh. They've never found a culture where people don't laugh, but not necessarily at the same things. Okay, humor is very cultural. And even the social aspect of laughing is very cultural. I've heard that Russians consider Americans like giggly school kids because we're laughing all the time to be sociable, and in Russia that's like weird. It's almost like hysteria. Babies start to laugh at 3 months, 4 months. And the really interesting thing is they start that even if they're blind or deaf, or both. In other words, they don't have to see other people laugh or hear other people laugh to start laughing. It's an automatic thing that starts. So let's look at what makes a baby laugh. Because if we think of babies, we think that's the most basic form of laughter, right? They haven't been acculturated yet into what's considered humorous or acceptable. The main things that make babies laugh are surprises or violation of expectations. So when I talk about surprises, it can be with bodily sensations. For instance, tickling is a surprising sensation, or people who kind of lift the baby up in the air, lift them up and down, that can make a baby laugh. An interesting thing about tickling, I'm very ticklish, and I hate to be tickled. So I find it very interesting that laughter, looking like I'm having fun, is the automatic reaction to that. And I've always wondered whether babies actually are having fun when you tickle them, and that it's something we outgrow. But even with babies, it's something that can be carried on too long. I don't know if anybody's seen the advertisement, promoting fatherhood, basically, where the guy is giving the baby raspberries on the belly, and the baby's just in hysterical laughter. And it goes on, and every time I look at it, I think, oh my God, he's torturing that poor kid. So something like playing peekaboo makes a baby laugh, so the surprise of hiding and reappearing. And strange sounds and sudden movements, you can make silly sounds and that makes them laugh. I saw a YouTube video where a baby was in hysterical giggles because his dad kept tearing a piece of paper. And every time he tore it, the little sound, and the baby would just burst into laughter. Okay? Things like silly faces as they get a little older, you put shoes on your hands. If they're old enough to realize that shoes don't belong on hands, that violation of expectation makes them laugh. So how does laughing benefit a baby? Well, if we look at the YouTube videos of babies laughing and we look at the number of views on a YouTube video, we can tell that babies laughing is something that other people find very appealing. It's something you enjoy hearing and you want to make it happen. So a baby's laughter encourages positive responses from the caregiver, and it encourages prolonged engagement with the caregiver. It's kind of a conversation. You do something to make them laugh, and they giggle, and it's so cute. You want them, and you probably laugh too, and you want them to do it again. So you do it again, and it keeps going back and forth with them encouraging you and you responding. And interestingly, these exchanges have patterns and rhythms that are very similar to conversation. So there's some theory that babies are actually starting to learn the pattern of social interaction and conversation in these exchanges. Now let's talk about what makes an adult laugh. We all know that humor is cultural. What some cultures find funny, others don't. I never got Jerry Lewis, but apparently the French loved him. But it's also very personal. So what makes one person laugh may not ring true for another person. But it's still based mostly on surprise and violated expectations. So most of the reason we laugh is surprise and violated expectations. So based on that, and wake you up a little bit, I want to share one of my favorite jokes. Okay, so there's a guy about 25, and he's in a bar. He's sitting at the bar drinking, and he notices down the bar a very attractive middle-aged woman, maybe twice his age, who is looking at him. And she comes over and sits by him, and she starts flirting with him. And he's thinking, wow, this is weird. She's twice my age. She could be my mom, but she's really attractive, so he goes with it. They have some drinks and they're flirting. And as the conversation goes on, the woman asks him, have you ever experienced a mother-daughter threesome? Of course, he's thinking, oh my God, if she looks like this, what would her daughter look like? And her daughter's probably about my age. So he's getting quite excited. He's going, no, but I'd like to. Oh, okay, why don't we go back to my place? So they go out to their cars, and he follows her home, and they go up to the door, they go in the front hall, she snaps on the lights, and she yells, Mom, you still awake? Okay, so I think we can all see the violated expectation there. The way it built you up to one expectation, and Phil's jokes had the same thing. Even a lot of punchy one-liners and dad jokes have the violated expectation. The most interesting thing is that most laughter isn't due to humor. It's social laughter. I'm reading again a quote. Contrary to expectation, most conversational laughter was not a response, this is what a researcher concluded, to jokes or humorous stories. Less than 20% of pre-laugh comments were remotely joke-like or humorous. Most laughter followed banal remarks such as, look, it's Andre. Are you sure? And it was nice meeting you too. So in other words, these people are just having normal conversation and they're laughing as just a way of social engagement. Mutual playfulness, in-group feeling, and positive emotional tone, not comedy, mark the social settings of most naturally occurring laughter. Laughter is more about relationships than humor. Okay, so that engagement, that interaction that we started as a baby continues into adulthood. And like I said, depending on your culture, you may expect a certain amount of laughter just to keep that group feeling, that playful feeling. Another really interesting thing is that a speaker in a conversation is about 50% more likely to laugh than their listener. They laugh at what they've just said, okay, which is contrary to our expectation, because we're used to thinking of like a comedian speaking to an audience, and they're not laughing at their own jokes, they want the audience to laugh, but the speaker is actually more likely to laugh. Like yawning, laughter is contagious. You're about 30 times more likely to laugh when you're in a group than when you're alone. We probably all experience this. I know I've experienced the sensation of watching a comedian on TV, and the audience is howling, and I'm kind of maybe chuckling, because I'm alone and they're all with each other, and there's that contagion, there's that group feeling of when you're watching a comedian. That's why they put laugh tracks in TV shows. There came a point, they used to film everything before a live audience and have the natural laughter of the audience. There came a point where that wasn't always financially viable, and they decided to replace it with a recorded laugh track, and they were happy to find that that worked, that helped people perceive the show as funnier. And maybe if you've been in an audience at a comedian show, you found yourself, really getting into it and laughing. There's that feel-good feeling. I mean, that's why comedians can command such huge audiences and such huge fees, because there's that great feel-good feeling of going home after a couple hours of laughing. There's also nervous laughter, so kind of like yawning. There's more than one reason you laugh, and you may laugh because you're nervous. I don't know how many of you remember the Mary Tyler Moore episode where she went to the funeral of Chuckles the Clown. It was one of the most famous episodes of that show. And she was sitting in the funeral and she couldn't quit laughing until finally she burst into sobs. Okay, and she just couldn't suppress the laughter. And we probably all had that situation where we're laughing to the point where we're, usually in response to something funny, where things are hurting and you just can't stop. Or you've seen the newscaster or, break into laughter and not be able to stop even though they want to. That kind of brings me to a really interesting historical event, the laughter epidemic of 1962 in Tanzania. I don't know how many of you have heard or read about that. It was during a time of political upheaval and rapid cultural change. And one day in school, 3 little girls started laughing hysterically and couldn't stop. Okay, so they sent them home, but they still couldn't stop. It started spreading through the whole school. It started spreading to other schools. Usually the people who were afflicted with it would laugh for maybe 10 days to 2 weeks before they could stop. And it was kind of a hysterical laughter. It was not a pleasant laughter. It was, like they just couldn't stop. It spread to over 1,000 people. It temporarily closed 14 schools, and it lasted for over 2 years, where it would die down and then start back up. I don't know if anything like that has ever happened again since, but a lot of researchers, while it was happening, they were taking blood tests, they were doing everything they could to try to figure out if it was an encephalitis or something like that, and they never found any physiological reason for it. It was just this kind of mass hysteria induced by probably the stress and political situation and the contagion of laughter. So in the end, looking at all that, why did we evolve laughter? So probably initially as a play signal, to let other, a lot of play is very rough, wrestling and stuff like that, so to let your playmates know that you're playing, you're not attacking them aggressively. And then as it went on, it started becoming a whole way to engage other people and to get that group feeling, so it creates social connection. Now, interestingly, there's a negative side to it too, which we're probably all aware of. Nobody likes to be laughed at unless you were trying to make somebody laugh. Okay, it can be very cruel to be laughed at. It can be, people really suffer when they're laughed at. And the people who are doing the laughing are probably creating a bond among themselves. So they're creating essentially that in-group feeling, and the person being laughed at is part of the out-group, and everybody's very aware of that. Another thing is if you try to make people laugh and they don't laugh, that's very uncomfortable. If you're trying to be humorous, that is very much a cut to you, a signal that you didn't make it. And then there's, I find really interesting the creepy laughter in horror films. There's not much more creepy than the little kids' creepy laughter in the background of a horror film. Okay, so that's what I found out about laughter. So where are we on time? Okay, so we got about 15 minutes. Okay. I had a couple other topics, but I'm going to skip to the one. Well, I'm going to talk really quickly about gossip. Why do we gossip? Once again, gossip is a universal human behavior. Researchers define it as talking or writing or reading about people who aren't present. They can be people you know who are part of your community. They can be celebrities, politicians, etc. Over half of male conversation falls under this definition, and about 2/3 of female conversation. But interestingly, most of it is not malicious. Only about 15% of that is negative, about 9% positive, and the remainder is neutral. So why do we do it? Well, when you gossip with somebody about somebody else's behavior, you're testing against other people your idea of what's acceptable. So everybody wants that constant social feedback of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable in our group. And you're testing how much your opinions line up with other people, so you know who your allies are. It reinforces those societal norms by letting people know what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. It lets you know who you can or can't trust, who you do or don't want as part of your group. If you hear you're being gossiped about, or if you're gossiping about somebody else because they did something underhanded. And it creates an intimacy between the gossiper and the listener. So when you share a little tidbit of information about somebody else, you're creating a bond with that person. You know, you're establishing a trust with that person. So once again, a little quote here. People hearing gossip, good and bad, about themselves, as well as negative gossip in general, showed more activity in the prefrontal cortex of their brains, which is key to our ability to navigate complex social behavior. So gossip actually does have an effect on the brain, and it's, once again, another social behavior. So you can see that as the thread that's been running through all of this, is that a lot of human behaviors that seem a little odd are social. So the last topic, and I could have done a whole talk on this one, I'm going to talk about music and dance and the effect of music and dance in humanity. What is music? It's a sound that creates a mental image in our brain in response to vibrating molecules. So the image is the image of sound. But once again, sound is not something that exists out there. Sound waves exist out there, but it's not until they hit our ears and get translated by our brain that they become sound. And music is highly organized sound. It has melody, rhythm, and timbre, is that how you pronounce it? Timbre? And many distinct styles, okay? So, for instance, we can tell the difference between the same note sung by a human voice and a saxophone and played on a piano. That's the timbre or tone. It is universal in humans, or appears to be. There's never been a culture found without it, but of course there's great variety. The first known musical instruments have been dated to be about 40,000 years old, things like bone flutes. Of course, they probably had music long before that. We can't tell if people were singing before that. We can't tell if they were using bones or sticks to mark rhythm before that. And everywhere, event ceremonies and milestones are marked by music. So it's something that every time something important happens, we mark it with music. Do animals have it? Well, we're listening to the birds up there. We all consider, I think, birdsong a form of music. Why do birds sing? There's a lot of reasons. They sing to attract mates. They sing to ward off rivals from their territory. So birdsong is very regional and it's learned. It's not something that a bird is born knowing. They know how to imitate other birds. And so they learn their regional songs, and other birds can respond to that, to know that they're in somebody else's territory. They use it to bond with their mates and young, so they sing back and forth to each other, kind of like humans. They warn others of danger. I was reading some really interesting stuff on this in a book about birds, that, for instance, there are some birds where depending on what they're singing, when they're warning of danger, they may be warning of an overhead predator, or they may be warning of a ground predator. And if the song is about an overhead predator, the other birds take cover. If the song is about a ground predator, the other birds take flight. And they've actually been able to even record these songs and play them back on recordings and see the birds respond to them in the same way, by taking cover or taking flight. So it appears to be almost a proto-language. There's meaning in those songs that other birds can interpret. We've heard whales singing. There are some apes that have some tones that can be considered singing. You may have seen some YouTube videos of seals that when they play music for them, they can keep the beat. And they can play different songs, and the seal figures out the beat of each song. And cockatoos, too, who not only keep the beat, but have invented their own little dances. There's theories about calming dogs with music. There's a whole set of CDs out that help you calm dogs with music. And there was a great video of an elephant, somebody playing piano for an elephant, and the elephant was just enchanted. Or cows coming over to listen to the piano. So we don't really know how many species their brains can interpret music, even if they don't make it themselves. So the big question is there a neurological or built-in basis for music in the human brain? And there are many indications that the answer is yes. Certain areas of the brain seem standing ready to process music from the earliest age, as we can see from brain activity. And it involves many areas. It's not just one area of the brain. Some researchers have even argued that humans have a musical acquisition module similar to a language acquisition module that recognizes and focuses, pays attention to music, to the structure. And we can see that most people can recognize aspects of music despite never having been formally taught. So for instance, most of us have the ability to keep a beat. Most of us have the ability to recognize differences in pitch and tell which one is higher and which one is lower. In fact, the brain does seem to have a special place just to process pitch. Lost my train of thought. Oh yeah. It's mapped directly so that if you have an EEG on that person, people watching the EEG can tell what note the person is listening to by the activity in the brain. And we all recognize, all cultures recognize the equivalence of two notes an octave apart. That do in one octave is the same note as do or C or whatever in the next octave, even though they're not, obviously not the same note. In fact, every known culture has the octave, which doubles the frequency. The distance between one octave and the next is a doubling in frequency as the basis for their music, even when they have different musical scales. And even some animal species appear to be able to respond to octave equivalence, to be able to train to do things based on octave equivalence. And we have the ability to recognize harmonious or disharmonious note combinations and things like that major chords sound happy and minor chords sound sad. I want to make sure I'm not running out of time here. Okay, a bit more about pitch. I said the ability to recognize pitch is mapped directly in the brain, which brings us to the topic of perfect or absolute pitch. People who can recognize a note when it's played. They can recognize not only the major notes, but all the sharps and flats and everything. In order to be able to put a name to that note, they have to have been taught it. And they usually have to have been taught it at a pretty young age. You lose the ability to be able to recognize the note that distinctly at a pretty young age. And for those people with absolute or perfect pitch, a lot of them describe it as the equivalent of being able to look at something and tell what color it is. It's that distinct to them. It's like the difference between red and blue, one note and the next note. There's a fascinating set of videos that I would recommend you watch on YouTube. There's a guy called Rick Beato, B-E-A-T-O, who's a musicologist, and he has all sorts of really fascinating stuff about music. His son Dylan, who's now I think about 10 or 11 years old, has an absolute pitch. His father started teaching him when he was very young to recognize, to be able to name the different notes. And now his father can play a two-handed chord with like 8 notes in it, bang, and the kid can name every note in it. And he hears them all as distinct notes. He can name every note in it, and he can tell what the name of the chord was. And sometimes it's, augmented this, diminished that, flat, seventh, I don't know. I mean, it's insane. So, and his father claims that, he's able to do that because he started with him at a young age teaching him that. Other evidence for the neurological basis of music. There's something called amusia. Kind of like aphasia, where you lose language. Amusia is where you lose music. You lose the ability to recognize music, becomes this kind of this clashing sound. A few people are born with it. We call them tone deaf. But most people acquire it by some brain accident. Maybe a hit on the head, a brain disease, or something like that. And all of a sudden, they can't understand music anymore. On the opposite side, there's people who after a brain injury or something like that, all of a sudden become obsessed with music and maybe even become kind of prodigious with music, of being able to learn it, to recognize it, to learn an instrument or sing when they couldn't before. Then there are musical savants and musical prodigies. So a savant being somebody who has severe limitations in other ways, for instance, autism. Maybe really severe autism where they really even can't interact with other people, but they recognize music. They can repeat a song on first hearing, play it on the piano. They can improvise on it. They can compose all sorts of amazing things. You've probably all seen examples of that. And then there's musical prodigies, which don't, have a pretty normal brain, but for some reason, are prodigies in music. And you see these 4- and 5-year-olds on piano or whatever playing these incredible symphonies. And there's a lot of question as to why. Is it something they were born with, or were they born into a super musical family where they were just exposed to it? Like Mozart, obviously his whole family was musicians, Bach. And then there's earworms. So an earworm is when you get a song in your head and you can't get it out. Okay? Earworms appears to be a completely universal experience. Everybody has it. There's certain songs that are more likely to create earworms than other songs. I know for me, if I know part of the words to a song, but I don't know all of it, the part that I know the words to will just keep cycling. And then when I get to the part where I don't know the words, will kind of fade off and go back to the part where I know the words. I found I can get rid of an earworm by learning the words to the whole song. Okay, but for all that we studied the neurology of music and the impact it has on the brain, for most people, the subjective experience of music is emotional, right? It affects our emotions. All we have to do is hear a song and it brings us back to the junior high dance, the dorm room, the wedding, or whatever. And it makes us feel like we felt at that time. And movies have always known this. Movies use music to tell you if something scary is about to happen, if something exciting is about to happen. You know, they basically cue you as to how you should be reacting emotionally to the scene. To the point where even with silent movies, they would hire somebody to come into the theater and play the organ or something to the movie, because especially without dialogue, it was hard to incite people's emotions. A 2015 review in The Lancet medical journal found that people who listen to music before, during, or after surgery experience less pain and anxiety. So it can have a very calming effect. It can kind of take you outside of yourself. So why did music develop in humans? Nobody's sure, but there are a lot of theories, and all may have a grain of truth. The first one is it's a predecessor to language. So in other words, that early humans, before they became full Homo sapiens, maybe used things like the birds, used inflection and tone to convey meaning. And eventually that evolved into full language, because language does have inflection. And they found that listening to music may actually help babies in language acquisition. It activates the parts of the brain that are tuning into things like tone and inflection. Maybe it's used to identify the tribe, as similar to birds. So if you've ever watched the continuous songs and chants in football stadiums around the world, I think that's a pretty good theory. You know, I'm on this side and you're on that side, and here's my song and there's your song. It was used possibly for sexual selection, mating calls, that somebody with a really good voice is demonstrating their evolutionary fitness to reproduce. And I don't know about you guys, but almost all of my celebrity crushes have always been on rock stars, not actors. So I agree with that one. And the musical is a mating call. Okay, perhaps it's a form of social bonding that evolved partly from motherese. The fact that when we talk to babies, we pitch our voice higher, we talk to them in a kind of sing-song way. We do that automatically, but they found that it really focuses the baby's attention. It really draws the baby's attention. So it could have started from that. As a way to mark rhythm for group tasks, to stay in sync. Okay, so in rhythm, rhythmic heartbeat is the first thing we hear. We hear it for months. So that, possibly the rhythm of music helps invoke those feelings. As a means of group bonding, once again, the experience of being, for instance, in a rock concert or other concert where the whole audience is kind of moving to the same beat, they're all singing the same song. It creates almost this hive mind, this group feel that you can't really get any other way. As the language of emotion, so that if normal language doesn't quite express emotion well enough, there's always music. And as a side effect of other human aspects, perhaps related to the human love for complex repetitive patterns. So there are some researchers who believe that we didn't evolve it at all, it's just a side effect of other things that evolved in us, like our love of patterns. So last topic about music I want to talk about is about memory loss and other brain dysfunction, and how it affects, how music affects it. Why do we remember the song lyrics so well? My head is full of commercial jingles from 50 years ago. It's full of theme songs from TV shows, from almost any song I heard during the 60s, 70s, and 80s, I can sing back. Okay, so there's some discussion about whether that's because we heard the song so many times. There's some discussion as to whether it's the melody that helps us remember it, the rhyme that helps us remember it, the rhythm that helps us remember it. Of course, we use the alphabet song to teach kids their ABCs, leading to a lot of kids who are under the mistaken impression for a long time that LMNOP is a letter. And there used to be a show called Schoolhouse Rock that I didn't watch as a child, but my brothers watched it. I was a teenager by that time. And I can still remember the preamble to the Constitution because they put it to music. Okay, and I wasn't even watching the show. It was just kind of playing in the background while I was doing other things, and I've still picked up that, and I still remember it. Okay, the idea of music and memory loss and other brain dysfunction has a very personal meaning to me. My mother suffered from Alzheimer's, and as she was, even when she got to the point where her short-term memory was pretty much shot, where she was having a very hard time recognizing people. She always recognized me as somebody she could trust, but some she thought I was her sister, some she thought I was her mother. Even when she was at that point, they had lots of entertainment in the assisted living where she was living. And she could still remember the words to her songs, she could still sing along. She had a lot of mood problems and behavior problems. The music would always focus her and calm her down. There's a lot of research in using music therapy for people with some of these issues. And it was really interesting to watch her just kind of come back into herself again. She felt like herself again. She could remember. You could probably put her back emotionally to where she was when she learned those songs. My dad, in the meantime, had a Parkinson's variant that affected his mobility quite a lot. When he listened to music, he got a lot of mobility back. He could move to the rhythm and stuff like that in a way that he couldn't when he wasn't listening to music. There's the example, for instance, that stutterers, which is considered a neurological problem, can sing fluidly. Okay, they can't get a sentence out, but you put them to music and off they go. There was a lot of actually famous musicians I was surprised to find out had been stutterers. I want to leave you with an interesting story from the neurologist Oliver Sacks. I don't know if any of you have ever read any of his books. They're absolutely fascinating, where he talks about the different things that can afflict us neurologically. And he had a story about a guy called Clive Waring, who was an eminent English musician and musicologist in his mid-40s, when he was struck with a form of encephalitis, this is in 1985, that left him with the most severe form of short-term memory amnesia that Sacks had ever seen or heard of. So he literally couldn't remember things for more than a few seconds. Most people with short-term memory loss can remember things for at least a few minutes. They can remember, by the time they get to the end of a sentence, they can remember how they started the sentence, that type of thing. But this poor guy literally, if he would blink and open his eyes again, everything was reset. It's like, where am I? So it's hard to imagine the kind of void he was living in, where from moment to moment he had no idea where he was, why he was there. He could still recognize his wife. He still had a lot of like muscle memory. He could still get dressed, tie his shoes, make a cup of tea, that type of thing. But he was just lost in this void. He was absolutely in despair. He knew something was wrong. He knew he should be remembering. He had this kind of feeling that he should have a continuity, or he should know what was happening, but he didn't. Okay, so it's one of the most sad things you can imagine when you're reading about it. But then at some point, somebody brought him some of his sheet music that he'd had while he was a musician, and he recognized it, and he could sing the songs. So they brought him to a piano, and they found he could still play the songs that he could play before he lost his memory. Now it's like, well, that's kind of interesting, but he could remember other things from before he lost his memory. But the really interesting thing was that he could keep his place in the song. He could remember where he was and where he was going. In other words, the song had continuity for him, whereas nothing else did. And he eventually got to the point where he could learn new songs. So he would practice these songs, and he would get better with each practice, but he couldn't remember actually ever having practiced them. He couldn't remember ever having seen them before, but he was still getting better with each practice. somebody would have to, guide him to which song to practice and let him know what he was working on. Other than that, he was getting better with each practice. He even got to the point where he could conduct a choir. So if you can imagine that, I mean, he is understanding the continuity of the song, where they are in the song, what the emotional response to the song should be at that moment, and he actually conducted a choir. So it gave him back his life, essentially. It gave him back his identity, and it gave him his place in the world again. Never quite like he was before, but so if you want to talk about the amazing power of music, I think that's a great story. Okay, so that's what I have for today. I think I'm about right on time, yeah. Okay, so